Call this meeting to order. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro 37.
Welcome to meeting number 37 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics.
Placed on a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23rd, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Now, this meeting is pursuant to Standing Order 1064. The committee is meeting at the request of members that had signed and delivered to the clerk a letter under 1064. And so we are here to discuss the request to undertake a study on the use of public funds in relation to the Roxham Road crossing. And I understand that Monsieur Villemure has supplied the clerk earlier today with the wording of a motion that he would like to move pursuant to the request for a meeting on this topic. And so I will give you the floor, Renee, and ask you for your remarks or to move the motion if you are planning to do so.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Oui.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a motion to table, and it goes as follows. That pursuant to Standing Order 1083H, the committee undertake as soon as possible a study to assess the ethical standards relating to public office holders related to the awarding of contracts for the reception of refugees and the development of infrastructure to receive asylum seekers in the province of Quebec, that the committee allocate a minimum of 6 meetings to conduct this study. The committee invite the Ministers of Immigration and Public Safety, representatives of the RCMP, Public Services and Procurement Canada, including Teresa Mayoni and Lynn Roy, respectively responsible and coordinator of access to information and privacy, officials of the Canada Border Services Agency, including Dan Prou, Executive Director and Chief Privacy Officer, and Mr. Pierre Guay. And all members should have received copies of this motion.
Thank you. We did have notice of the motion in advance, and it is in order. Now, I thought I saw you with your hand up. Are you okay? I see Yara as well. So I saw you first. If you want to speak, go ahead. If not, I can go straight to Yara.
Can I get in after Yara, please?
Yes, you may. So far, I have Yara and you. Any other? And wave if someone wants the floor, and I can maintain a list. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Sachs. You have the floor.
Oops, just let me unmute myself. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to colleagues for today. I want to thank Mr. Villemure for putting forward this motion. However, he raised this in the House, I think it was some time ago, December 14th, if I'm not mistaken, when you asked your question, when he asked his question in the House with regards to Roxham Road at that time, and quite a fair bit of time. We're nearly at a year since that first question in the House was raised by Mr. Villemure, and I don't disagree with him. The issue of refugees and asylum seekers, who we proudly as Canadians make space for those who need refuge here in Canada, is an issue of concern for many Canadians, myself included, that they have safe passage, safe access in ways that both protect them but make sure that our border services are doing the jobs that they need to do. And, from December till now, it seems like quite a bit of time has passed since first raising that question. And there's been a lot of good work done in committee since I've joined this committee, including the recent facial recognition technology report that we did, which was a request put forward by the NDP, which I was happy to support that study because it was an important issue, and we've explored many important issues here, and I'm just trying to understand the scope of urgency that Monsieur Villemure is seeing at this moment in time. Nothing has changed in Roxborough Road in the last 10 or so months. The property is the same property. The setup to assist those who are asylum seekers has been the same setup all this time. So the variables haven't really changed from when he first raised the question in the House last December until now. So we have a lot of important work to do here. We've made space for some important work in other studies. I've enjoyed my time in these studies. And I'm just trying to ensure that the work of this committee that we've committed to in our work plans and the questions that we need to ask are really the ones that we're putting forward in the studies that we're planning to do. And, that's the first part of what I'd like to clarify with Mr. Villeneuve, but also, what is it that we're asking about here? Are we looking at the issue of Roxham Road itself as a point of entry and its continued use as a point of entry? It is one of the safest points of entry for many asylum seekers, as opposed to some of the horrific stories we've heard at cross points in Manitoba and Saskatchewan in the dead of winter, which have been heartbreaking stories of those who are seeking safe haven here. So, if it's a matter of the point of entry at Roxham Road, and if those are the questions of how it's managed and how that's being done, then I'm not really sure that this is the place we should be exploring it at ethics. It's an immigration question, and I think there's important questions that we should be asking there in the management of point of entry for asylum seekers. However, I'm really unclear as to if none of the variables have changed from his question in December until now. And looking at the importance of having these point of entries like Roxham Road, why we're necessarily entertaining to ask these questions here. I'm really unclear as to what we're trying to get at in entertaining a study in the middle of our own work plan of 6 meetings. I just want to make sure that our time here is used well and wisely, and that we're really getting to the heart of the questions that need to be addressed in this committee. So I thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to share my comments, and I will pass the floor back to you.
Thank you. And Ms. Khalid, you're next. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. I'm going to continue a little bit as to what my colleague, Ms. Sachs, was referring to. I mean, we've been sitting here with opposition parties for about a year now. We've engaged on some really important questions. We've put forward motions that I think are really important to study, and we have done them. We have the FRT study, which the NDP proposed, and we completed. We had the mobility study, which the Conservatives proposed, and we've completed. We've had the RCMP study, which the Bloc proposed, we've completed. We've been waiting about 3 years now to get one of our studies studied. And I realized that the ATIP study, which was up next, is one that's proposed by the Conservatives. I'm happy to have that done. Calling a 1064 when we've had ample opportunity to have discussions, to put this on the list, to actually do the job of this committee, whether it's to hold government to account or to ensure that the public is well aware of what we're doing. I think we could have handled this situation a little bit better. And the second point with Ms. Sachs with respect to the scope of what this motion presents. In the letter, it is kind of all over. We're looking at whether this is an immigration issue or a public safety issue, or are we looking to see what the general procurement process is? I think that we do need to have those conversations. We need to engage with each other. And I have noticed over the past, months and months, where I do put in an effort, we put in an effort to make sure that we're having those conversations. We want better government. We're sitting at the table, and we want to engage with you folks. So it was very strange to me that you all, members of the opposition, got together. You guys had your substantive discussions. You put together a letter. And now, we're sitting here in a 1064 situation where we could have just included this as part of our study agenda for the year. It's not uncommon. Obviously, you know, the way that the committee has operated. We talk about, you know, open, transparent. We talk about holding government to account. Well, the opposition has a responsibility to that too, folks. You know, we're here. We're ready to engage. We would love for you guys to engage right back and have those important conversations. I absolutely agree. We do need to have these questions put on the table. We need to ask these questions. We need to have the study, absolutely. But, you know, to Ms. Sachs's point, what is the urgency right now? Why are we doing this at this given time? Why could we not have, in an open discussion, been able to put this within our framework of what we're doing for the year? Now, I myself have 2 motions on notice, and I'd like to get those on the agenda too. And I'm willing to work with you guys to see how we can push forward these issues. So, you know, like I want to have those conversations. I want to be included in the conversations that you guys have amongst each other. It would be nice to work together. We talk about open, transparent government. I would love to see an open, transparent opposition also, and see how we can bring it all home, folks. So I do have some specific amendments that I do want to propose, but perhaps I'll cede the floor to other speakers and get their initial thoughts in first. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Khalid. Next, I have Mr. Bazan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the comments from Ms. Khalid and Ms. Sachs. I want to thank Ms. Villeneuve for bringing forward this motion. I think it is an important motion, and I think that we want to make sure the study is very tight in how we approach it. We don't want to be crossing over into, you know, mandates of other committees. Like, so the issues around you know, the contracts, the issues around, you know, immigration, those are things that will be dealt with by other committees if they so choose. This here is very specific about the ethical behavior of public office holders and how those contracts were awarded. And that's what we're going to be digging into here. So I think that what Mr. Villeneuve is brought forward, or Villemure brought forward, is very succinct. And I know that as a committee, you know, we have been very successful for the most part in getting reports into the House and good work done. And I believe that, you know, even though we have the access to information report or study starting fairly shortly, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can run 2 different studies concurrently during the time, and I think we got plenty of time between now and our Christmas break to get this work done. So I don't see how, you know, the Liberals are saying that this is important, and I invite them to participate in this, to support it, so that we can get moving forward, and maybe some of those motions that Ms. Khalid has put on notice, that maybe they'll be successful. Who knows? We have to get them onto the floor and have that discussion, and maybe there's time by the end of this meeting that we could actually have those discussions if she so chooses to move those for further debate. But you know, I think that there is a spirit of collaboration around the table, and that we could, and we've shown that in past studies over the last few months. So I think that there is an opportunity here to put together a good report and really get down to the bottom of some of the accusations that were made. And she says, why is the urgency, as Ms. Sachs said, why the urgency doing it now? Well, there were some accusations that were made in the media last week that changed the scope of what's been happening down on Roxham Road. And that's why I think we need to look at the behavior of some public office holders that are tied to those contracts.
Next, I have Monsieur Paulus.
Merci.
Thank you. The file is quite specific and is of the purview of the Ethics Committee. I have worked in many different functions, and in this case, there's a clear notion of ethics, and that's why I believe that it needs to be done here. When we're asked what's with the urgency, well, we can't forget that we're talking about spending over the past 5 years of $500 million around La Colle and the Roxham Road. But we have specific questions on La Colle. There are people involved in this, hidden contracts. We invoke national security reasons. It's ridiculous, but the notion of ethics is in the information that we received and in the information received from Radio-Canada. This is research that was done, and when Radio-Canada has a show on it and with relevant information, well, it is important to examine this because contracts have been renewed for 5 years and we have very important questions to ask, and here is the best forum to do so. And there are a lot of questions that are not answered in other committees because there is a lack of ethics, which is not the case here.
Thank you. I don't have a whole lot new to add, but I just want to agree with my colleagues, Ms. Khalid and Ms. Sachs, that it seems that this motion is coming out of the blue, although I've been hearing the Bloc Québécois talk about it in the House for months now, every day, and I don't understand why we have a study that says, for example, as soon as possible, this needs to be studied. I also am interested in the ATIP study that we have scheduled to come up next, and I'm interested in getting to the bottom of that study. And I'm not sure why this study fits with our mandate here on the Ethics Committee. So I think those are my main points. I mean, I know that Roxham Road is also a valuable resource for a lot of people who don't have other ways to come into the country. I know there's another member of Parliament who arrived in the country through that access. And as far as I understand, the government was responding to the need when it invested in that road. I don't know, or invested in the resources to help those vulnerable people access the country. So I just want to reiterate the points made by my colleagues. This seems like it's coming out of the blue. I don't know if we've seen collaboration around the whole table or just among the members of the opposition. It seems like it's hit us out of the blue, and I'd prefer to move on with some of the studies that we already have in the hopper, like the ATIP study. But it seems like I've lost the attention of the members opposite, so I'll pass the chair over, or the floor back over to you.
I have Ikra next. Ms. Khalid, go ahead.
Walking and chewing gum at the same time? Talking and listening at the same time?
Thank you.
Ms. Khalid has the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just pick up on a point that Mr. Bazan made that I think is really important with respect to tightening the scope of the study. I do realize that, you know, in the spirit of collaboration, I would like to ensure that I'm able to get my motions to be studied as well. I would like to make sure that the issues that the opposition feel are so important are also studied. And Mr. Bazan's absolutely right. We do have to narrow it to the scope of what this committee is all about. So when I read the original 1064 letter that went to you, Mr. Chair, you know, it does talk about a whole bunch of things which I think is out of the scope. We are not here to talk about processes of how IRCC is working or what the function of Roxham Road is or what the procurement processes have been with this respect, or whether this is a good use of resources or not, or are there enough resources or not. The letter indicates that, you know, we have to make sure that it's open, transparent government, and that resources are being used effectively. And I think that we're okay to keep it at that scope. And in the interest of ensuring that we have enough time for other studies, that we're not just, you know, for so many meetings long, just kind of saying the same things again and again and again. I think I will perhaps seek to amend the motion as presented by Monsieur Villemure for the removal of the Minister of Immigration
as a witness in the, again, agreeing with Mr. Bazan, because there are some things that may be being studied in other committees, and I think that we need to be cognizant of duplicating certain works. So I would propose that as an amendment to the main motion for the removal of the Minister of Immigration as a listed witness, just to, again, make it tight, to bring it within the scope of what we're doing here in ethics, and in the spirit of collaboration with Mr. Bazan and trying to get concretely done what Mr. Bazan has said he would like us to do.
We have an amendment, and the amendment is in order. Discussion on the amendment. Point of order, go ahead, Mr. Kirk.
Just to clarify, the amendment is simply to remove, looking at the motion here, to remove Minister of Immigration, but keep Minister of Public Safety, just to, okay.
So we are clear on the amendment. Discussion on the amendment. Seeing, okay, all right, go ahead, Ms. Khalid, you may continue on the amendment then.
Thank you so much. I was, hoping that that members wanted to maybe see if this was a proper scope of an amendment. So, is it proper to limit, in terms of the issues that we want to talk about here, specifically with respect to Roxham Road. There was one other thing that really struck me in the letter that kind of speaks to this amendment also, and that is the indication that for some reason the gentleman that is involved, Monsieur Pierre Gay, who's a businessman known for his donations to the Liberal Party. I found that to be a little strangely placed within the letter. I'm sure Monsieur Villemure, as he was drafting this letter, would have known that Monsieur Pierre Gay was also a donor to the Conservative Party. When we're talking about, again, like within the scope, when we're talking about transparency and trust in the public institutions, we're talking about how do we narrow that and actually study the issues that matter. I think the way that this letter outlines it really shows that we're not indeed focused on the right issues, that we are, by virtue of continuing to say again and again and again that this is, eroding the public trust, or there's no trust in government institutions. I think the opposition is kind of doing that part of just eroding that trust themselves. So again, I go back to my initial point to say, look, folks, we want to play ball. We want to make sure that what we're doing effectively, that what we're doing is effective as a government, that the way that we do it is open and transparent, and that we should continue to provide the support that not only Canadians need, but also the principles and the importance of providing the humanitarian support as needed without scapegoating, without calling into light people that may not then want to play ball in the future, or that may be scared off to say, oh no, should anybody engage with governments or political parties or what have you, that now all of a sudden we're going to get targeted. And I think that is not a precedent that we should be setting here. I think that the way to move forward is through my amendment to kind of limit the scope of what it is that we're studying, and having the Minister of Public Safety, having the RCMP and the other officials as listed in the motion, would keep that scope to the issue that is in front of us right now. So I'm hoping that I can get the support of members opposite to support my amendment. Thanks, Chair.
And I will I take a moment just to remind all members that we are debating the amendment and not the general motion. And I would ask that remarks be specific to the amendment. Once the amendment is disposed of, we can certainly take additional time to debate the rest of the motion. So with that, go ahead, Ms. Sachs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to thank Mr. Bazan about the agreement, at least in principle, of making sure that we are tight on scope, particularly with the work of this committee. With regards to the amendment of Ms. Khalid in terms of questions of Roxham Road as a point of entry for asylum seekers, it is I would say it is far better placed at immigration than here to ask those questions. But in terms of what we do here in this committee, particularly on the issues of procurement and that this has been a place that has been that funds have gone into for the past 5 years to address the needs. We have to really be cognizant of what we're looking at here.
Bank
The
in
border
Wellington would be
police.
great.
Greg, your microphone is on. Roxham Road came into existence not because CBSA decided to set up a point of entry there, is that asylum seekers have been going there for years. As Ms. Hefner mentioned, one of our colleagues in the House, actually, her point of entry into Canada was through Roxham Road. And it is known as a place for asylum seekers. And since it is known and it's known internationally, the sheer volume and demand and the need, and also the climate there, it is cold through the winters, and the need to facilitate safe entry for those who are seeking safety is critical, and that costs money. That costs money to our border services, and it is up to our agencies like procurement to ensure that the tools that we need to provide safe space for asylum seekers when they arrive is there. So, and when we're looking at a span of time and the costs and the needs that are associated with that, I would ask again if those are necessarily scope questions that we ask here, because surely we would want to ensure that the services provided. I mean, I have no issue with the Minister of Public Safety coming here to discuss what reactionary implementation has been put into place at Roxham Road to address the volume of asylum seekers that are coming into that place. But are we asking the question of is this a new border crossing, or are we asking the question? I'm just trying again that we're clear on who's coming to the table to unpack the questions that we want to ask on the monies that are spent at this site to facilitate people having safe entry when they come here seeking asylum 12 months of the year, through rain or shine, through freezing cold winters, that they're able to arrive to safety with dignity and compassion. And it just, again, the transparency and accountability, I'm with you. We absolutely want to make sure that we have that in all the things that we do, including the operations at Roxham Road, but also, with a deep understanding of why we do them, of why, as being a third party country that we are in accepting asylum seekers, that when folks arrive for safety here, that we are able to provide them with the services and tools that they need when they arrive at our border. And so, I just want to be clear on keeping the scope where it needs to be, and ensuring that the funds that we allocate to provide services and tools there, and also understanding who's there. I mean, we didn't choose, the government of Canada did not choose this as a boarding crossing, as a point of entry. Asylum seekers have, and who geographically was in the area, what buildings, what landowners are around there, to ensure that they're being crossed through their areas, that we're finding the right balance of making sure that those who cross are protected, but also recognizing if this isn't a federally mandated border area, then how do we work with who is there to ensure? In this case, it's Monsieur Pielguet, who I understand is one of the main landowners in the area and the buildings and that he owns. How do we ensure that if there is only one sole proprietor in the area, that the contracts are negotiated the way they should be, because we need to provide services for those who arrive and use the tools that are available to us, with deep consideration and of course transparency and accountability. So I'm just, again, I certainly do hope that we are all working collaboratively to ensure that the questions that we want to ask are the right questions and that the scope is clear. And I'll cede the floor back to you, Mr. Chair. Those are my thoughts at the moment about the motion.
Okay, and I see Ms. Khalid is, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to perhaps outline what exactly happens within the center and why I think that removing the Minister of Immigration helps us to scope this motion effectively. So the IRCC, Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, is responsible for the accommodations of claimants that arrive there until they're transferred to the province, including the 14-day isolation period, which was mandatory then for claimants without a suitable quarantine plan, for example. So IRCC, in addition, supports the CBSA's eligibility determination processing. So given that IRCC is playing more of a supporting role with respect to the functioning of this center, I believe that it would be outside of the scope of our mandates. I mean, imagine if we bring in the minister responsible for this specific file. What kind of questions would we be asking the minister? Would we be asking them about how do they process? How do they support? How many files do they go through on a daily basis? What their day-to-day looks like, which I think would fall completely out of the purview of our committee, looking at the scope of what it is that we're trying to do here, and take it into a rabbit hole that would overlap with work that other committees would be doing. So that's why I again ask my colleagues to support my amendment to remove the Minister of Immigration from this list of witnesses. As I said, I have no problems with other witnesses as they're listed. I just think that having the Minister of Immigration within this motion would broaden this study to the point where it would fall outside of the scope of the work that this committee is mandated with and should be doing. So I'll leave it at that, Chair. Thanks.
Right. Is there anybody else? Do we have any other speakers on the amendment? Failing. Okay, I see none, so I'm going to call for a vote on the amendment. And in hybrid, we do this in reverse, and I first ask, is there anyone opposed to the amendment? Okay, Mr. Green, there are members opposed to the amendment, and so I will go to a vote then, unless someone wants it adopted on division. Then if we have opposed, we'll go to a recorded vote then. So, yeah, go ahead, Madam Clerk, and conduct the vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The vote is on the amendment from Ms. Khalid to remove the words Minister of Immigration. Mr. Baines.
I vote for.
Monsieur Fergus.
Je vote pour.
Ms. Hefner.
In favor.
Ms. Khalid.
I vote in favor.
Ms. Sachs.
En faveur.
Mr. Bazan.
Against.
Mr. Carrick.
Against.
Monsieur Villemur.
Je vote contre.
Mr. Williams.
Je vote contre.
Mr. Green.
Triple control.
Triple, triple, triple. Did you vote? Okay, just the four. Okay. Je substitue, but
Amendment is defeated.
Microphone, please.
Are there any speakers on the main motion? Okay, go ahead, Ms. Hefner, followed by Ms. Khalid.
Given that my colleague's motion didn't pass, I also had another part of that motion I wanted to address. I see that we have in this motion that the committee allocate a minimum of 6 meetings to conduct this study. To me, that sounds like a lot for this study, given that we've, given the number of witnesses that we have listed, and given the scope, and given the fact that we have so many other studies in front of us that we should get to. I'm not sure that 6 meetings, it seems like a little bit too much to me. It seems like a lot of time that this committee would be spending on something that we've just addressed. So I think that would be my point. I would maybe request, can I put forward a motion to remove or to switch it to a minimum of, say, 2 meetings to conduct this study?
You have the floor, and while you have the floor, you're entitled to make any amendment, move any amendment you wish, as long as it's in order. So if you wish to make an amendment, go ahead and do so.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the guidance, given that I'm still quite new to this committee. And so I would like to move that we strike that the committee allocate a minimum of 6 meetings and maybe replace it with a minimum of 2 meetings to conduct this study. I think that we can do it in 2 meetings. No?
6 hours long each, yeah.
So maybe I just strike that we allocate a minimum of 6 meetings, and we can speak further about how many meetings that we should conduct this study over. But it just seems to me that 6 is way too many.
I do need you. If you wish to change this motion, I do need you to be specific. So if it's your intent to,
A minimum of 6 meetings
okay,
from the motion.
okay, that motion is in order. If I understood Ms. Hefner correctly, the motion is simply to strike
The minimum
the
of
words,
6 meetings.
allocate a minimum of 6 meetings. So there will be no minimum, no maximum. There will be no comment in the motion on the number of meetings. That's
Right,
your
and then
intent.
the committee can
Okay.
decide if it
Yeah.
needs
The,
more meetings. If we can get it all done in 2 meetings, then we can just wrap up, and we're not committed to 6 meetings, whether or not we need them.
Okay, thank you. So the amendment is in order. I have on my speaking list, I have Ms. Khalid, followed by Ms. Sachs, and I see Mr. Fergus has also put his hand up, so that is the current list of speakers. Go ahead, Ms. Khalid.
Thanks, Chair. I would hate to do this, but given that my colleagues on the opposite side don't really engage, maybe we'll just engage with ourselves. I would disagree with Ms. Hefner. I think that we Sorry, folks. I think that we do need to limit or to clearly outline how long such a study should be within the scope that we have spoken about. The work plan, I mean, we have the Minister of Public Safety, we have officials, Monsieur Pierre Gay, we have other witnesses. I think 1 hour per witness should be more than sufficient. And so I would propose maybe a sub-amendment to Ms. Hefner's amendment as proposed. Sorry, I'm just looking at the wording so I can get it right.
So I think Ms. Hefner is proposing that the words that the committee allocate a minimum of 6 meetings to conduct this study be struck from the motion. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the amendment that we're currently debating.
Right. So if I wanted to propose a sub-amendment, would I then say that the committee allocate a 2 meetings to conduct this study? Would that make sense, Chair?
You are, and you're specifying that's both, I guess, a minimum and a maximum.
I'm just saying 2 meetings.
Okay,
No
so
minimum.
you would, so currently we're debating the amendment to delete the words allocate a minimum of 6 meetings. You're instead proposing to, that the committee allocate 2 meetings.
Yes, Chair.
Okay, so that is the first rule on the sub-amendment, and I rule that it is in order. And now I have a point of order from Mr. Bazan.
I'd make the argument, Mr. Chair, although you've already ruled on it, is that the sub-amendment changes the intent of the original amendment, which was to take away any restrictions on meetings, minimums or maximums. So I would have suggested that Ms. Hepner amendment be voted on first, and then Ms. Khalid could move her amendment to specify the minimum number of meetings.
Okay, I had ruled on it, and I saw the intent as being less specific in Ms. Hefner's motion, but if there is no further debate, we can go straight to voting on the sub-amendment and then deal with the amendment.
Mr. Chair, I believe my hand is up.
Yes, that's correct. I did see that you were next, and so if you wish to speak now, we are debating the sub-amendment. And that will, so if you can limit your remarks, I've given a lot of latitude on the debate on the last amendment, but I'm going to ask that we focus on the sub-amendment of the number of meetings, and go ahead. You have the floor, Ms. Sachs.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And in the spirit of agreement and disagreement and collaborative efforts here, if I go back to my colleague, Mr. Bazan, who really wanted us to be clear on the specificity of what we're studying in this committee, I think that Ms. Khalid's comments are actually even more important in the sub-amendment that she's moving, because, again, I've been here a year. I've spoken to colleagues across the way about matters of importance of studies that we wish to do. Sometimes we've agreed and disagreed on them, and Mr. Green's nodding his head. So, he and I have had quite a number of conversations of prioritizing and making sure good work gets done. And I would say the same is true here. I just think that if we keep it structured, rather than open-ended, then we will get to, and we know we're clear on the witnesses that we need to have here. We can get through the study and have clarity on exactly what we're trying to address in this committee, and then move on to the other important matters of the day that studies that we've put forward. For example, I've gone back and forth on single digital ID and the importance of having that discussion as well here in this forum. So, for the sake of keeping us on track for the studies and the important work that we all wish to do, I'm very supportive of Ms. Khalid in giving this legs. If Mr. Villemure sees there's a sense of urgency here, as it appears that other colleagues do, although I'm not quite sure after 10 months where the urgency lies, that we at least keep it tight. Let's keep it structured, keep it tight, so that we can continue with the other important work that we have to do here. And yes, Mr. Bazan, I do walk and chew gum as well, so I hear you on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And next I have Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Puis,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to apologize for my lateness at this meeting. That's one of the disadvantages of the hybrid system, is that we can continue to shirk our responsibilities efficiently as MPs. But anyway. With regards to Mr. Villemure's motion, I don't think there's anything there, but we will do our duty. I know that when the opposition wants something, they will get it. But really, six meetings of our committee? When we had started planning more important files on facial recognition, for example, we had proposed 6 meetings to start. And that is something that has an impact on so many people. And for a file on something seen in Radio-Canada that shows, surprise, surprise, that in this case there was a businessman who contributed to the Conservatives, who now contributes to the Liberals, and perhaps in the future this person will contribute to the Bloc. I mean, there's not much in it. And Mr. Green, your day will come. Your day in the spotlight will come. I believe that 6 meetings is too many. We have the proposal here to have a minister and staff and people who are directly responsible for Roxham Road, including the person who made those contributions. And we could add a host of other people. I have a hard time understanding how we could fill out more than 2 meetings, Mr. Chair. I think that would be 4 hours of testimony for something that can be solved fairly easily. If we're so concerned and we think that something's strange, we could send it to the Auditor General for her to investigate and go into detail, as is her responsibility. But for us, I think that with the time that we have, and if we ask questions and we try to respond to the concerns of Mr. Villemur and the concerns of other Canadians who want to know that things are being well managed, I'm confident that we can do that in 2 meetings. And that way, we could move on to other topics that concern us, for example, access to information, and determine the other studies that we would like to do and haven't tabled in the House yet. We can have a good discussion between colleagues, and some will find it funny, but I think it shows our goodwill in this case. We want to find the best way to do this study. But I think that if the cameras were off and we were in camera, if we had the type of discussions that we usually have without cameras, I think everyone would say, honestly, René, thank you, but six a little too many, you know? Maybe we can find a way of being more efficient. That's why I am asking this of all of you. If we could have as a goal 2 meetings, I think that we could quickly move on to other files that I find much more important. But we do need to do our due diligence, and hopefully the evidence that we will hear will prove that there's nothing there and that things are being done properly, and so we can move on to something else. So, Mr. Chair, I do like my colleague's sub-amendment, Ms. Khalid's sub-amendment, and as former chair of this committee, I think she has a lot of empathy for you, and I hope that we can find a way to have an amicable agreement. Oh, it wasn't this committee. Apologies. It was justice. You're right. Well, yes, that's it. Apologies. I have a lot of respect for you chairing the committee, and I have a lot of esteem for Ms. Khalid and the Justice Committee as well. So let's hope that we can agree on 2 meetings, colleagues. I think that that is reasonable. 4 hours. I would be surprised to find that we would need more than that. I would be incredibly surprised. Thank you.
Next, I have Ms. Khalid, followed by Mr. Green.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to, again, just highlight that getting through these witnesses within the time of 2 meetings is absolutely possible. We have 6 witnesses that are listed here, and I think that if we're able to, with 1 hour blocks each, I think we should be able to get through all of them. I understand the importance of this motion. I also understand the importance of ensuring that we're spending our time as efficiently as possible. And I think that 2 meetings is a very efficient way for us to get through this issue and move on to other important issues which are also on our docket, Chair. So, again, just saying 2 members in the opposite. We would like, and I think that it's reasonable for me to suggest that we do this study within 2 meetings. And I will also highlight that had members of the opposite consulted with us and we'd had this conversation rather than being called in on a 1064, we could have used this as one of the meetings, again, to be more efficient. Instead of, the opposition trying to find gotcha moments, which make no sense to me at all. We're at the table or trying to play ball. Would be nice to have those discussions. Again, just looking for efficient use of our time, and I think that 2 meetings would be quite sufficient. Thanks, Chair.
Now, Mr. Green.
Thank you. I want to note the use of the word efficient while we're simultaneously experiencing a small but mini filibuster, the government side debating themselves on the matter. And while I look at this, I need to be convinced that there is a smoking gun. I'll say out of whatever goodwill may be remaining around the table that from my perspective, if in the first couple of meetings, although I have no interest in maximizing it at 2, but within the first 2 or 3 meetings, I will say that if I find that the evidence does not compel further exploration, I would be open to reducing it from 3 weeks to 2 weeks or something like that. But I will be supporting the motion as it stands now, noting that the committee does have the purview to either extend or conclude, pending on the evidence that's presented. But what I will say is that if we're going to talk about efficiency, then let's show it, right? And let's not filibuster topics where we could just quickly move through the business and get to what needs to be done here. And so, from that perspective, I'm putting it out there to all parties that if we embark on this and it becomes apparent early on that there isn't, in fact, ethical breaches that would be relevant to the mandate of this committee, then I would be open to concluding the committee or having it referred to other places. As it stands now, based on what is reported and having spent some time on procurement and public services, on OGO and on public accounts, I can share with you that, like, you know, I'm concerned with how this is being presented. And we've heard it here today, both from the implications of, you know, donors from both the Liberal and the Conservative side. And I thank the member from the bloc for raising this important issue. I do think it's timely. Like this notion that somehow it's, you know, just coming out of the blue suggests that maybe perhaps folks aren't keeping up with the news in Quebec. I know I do. Sometimes I make it, and I certainly watch it. So, you know, from that, I just want to put it on to all parties. If we get into this, and quite frankly, I don't think there's anything there, you may find me withdraw my support from making it go 4, 5, 6 weeks. But early on, if we get the evidence that suggests it demands further exploration, I'm also on for expanding it if it so requires to have witnesses. Because ultimately with these issues, and they're quite right, if there's one point I would concede to my friends on the Liberal side, is that these exercises do erode public trust. And when it erodes public trust, it's not partisan. Like, basically, people look at all of us the same way, including parties that may or may not even be involved. And so I want to go through it carefully. You know, I'm hopeful that we can explore topics of what it's like to be a whistleblower within government, what it's like to have procurement that is open and transparent, what the code of conflict looks like, what lobbying looks like, all these things that are pertaining to the mandate of this committee. So those are my only remarks for today, and they will be my only remarks. I just wanted to put everybody on notice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Now I have Mr. Fergus.
Monsieur le Président, puis j'étais...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For Canadians who are listening to us today, I appreciate the comments of my colleague, Mr. Green. But I know how this is going to go. If we determine that we need 6 meetings, what Canadians don't know is, in camera, what we'll do as MPs is to discuss the list of witnesses. When we know that it's going to be 4 hours, well, we will plan to have witnesses for those 4 hours. And we will select the people that we think are the best placed to give us the best information to support our study. If we decide that we're going to have 12 hours of testimonies, well, then what's going to happen is that everyone is going to fill up the bucket with witnesses, and we'll invite everyone, their cousins, to come testify. And at some point, we'll say maybe after a few hours of meetings, we'll say, well, there's nothing there. There's no scandal here. But some people will say, wait a minute. We have another 24 people that we had proposed to receive at this committee. Maybe we should listen to absolutely everyone before we can determine that there's nothing there, even though from the get-go we know there's nothing there. That's what happens, Mr. Chair. So yes, I know that my colleague Mr. Green would like for us to be very efficient, but let's talk about the real things here. We'll find means to have these testimonies until we go beyond the reasonable limit of witnesses. That's why, Mr. Chair, I think that in order to be efficient, we should carefully and judiciously choose the people that we want to invite to talk about this file. And in so doing, we'll have the opportunity to determine whether or not there is a prima facie speech or file where we can say, oh, actually, there is something in this. There's something here. And we need to dig a little deeper. But that's not the case. Secondly, what happens if we decide that we want 6 meetings that spans over multiple weeks? It's important to determine now how we're going to take on this topic. Mr. Chair, I was perhaps not the best student in university, but there's one thing I knew how to do, and that was how to take a test. And before I answered questions, I always examined all of the questions asked on the test to know, okay, what's the context, so that I can have an idea of the situation as a whole. It's the same thing here. Before we move on to inviting everyone willy-nilly because we have to fill in the time that we've allocated, I think it is much better to look at the situation as a whole. We could perhaps ask our analysts to prepare a document to help us. Or, if we go with Mr. Green's suggestion, perhaps what we could do would be to say, okay, we'll have 2 meetings. We'll use 4 hours of our time. We'll invite people who are responsible for that program and for the allocation of the contract and the people who are delivering the contract. We'll speak to the main stakeholders in this motion, and we'll get a quick overview. And if we see that there's a smoking gun, as said Mr. Green in good Latin, well, then we can move on to something else. But to say right away that we need 6 meetings, 12 hours of our time, when we have other matters to study, I think that's a waste. It's a huge waste of our time. So I think it is reasonable that we take all the time now to have the debate on this matter. If we need to talk about different options on the table in order to determine specifically what we want to study, well, then we can take the time to do that today instead of wasting 6 or 7 meetings just because. Mr. Chair, I think that there is a point of order.
Other members that have had their hand up to speak, but yeah.
That's all there is to it. If you guys keep it up, I'm going to withdraw.
Alors, est-ce que ça c'est
That's the reason why we need to take the time to talk about this. Threats serve no purpose. It wasn't captured by the microphones, but let's take the time now to talk about the modalities of our next meetings. We often say in Parliament that our most precious resource is the allocation of their time, and that is what we're doing here. And I think that it is important to find that, because if not, I think it'll be a bit of a witch hunt. It'll be a waste of time, and I don't see how we can justify 6 meetings on this when we could have this done in 2 meetings where we hear from our witnesses, we ask our questions that are going to be well targeted, relevant, because we know that our time is limited. And if somebody wants to propose something under 6 meetings, well, maybe I'd be interested in hearing that option. But six is way too many. That's way beyond what we need, Mr. Chair. And that's why I will vote for the sub-amendment proposed by Ms. Khalid. And I hope that my colleagues will agree.
Monsieur Paulus, on the sub-amendment.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to remind my colleagues opposite of a situation in which the Ethics Committee conducted a study that lasted 1 meeting with the Frank Baylis contracts. The whole ethical issue with Baylis was to have a contract of $237 million when the market was saying that it wasn't worth more than $100 million. 10,000 ventilators, which was disproportionate. We had 1 meeting. We couldn't get to the end of the matter. So we have a contract of $237 million, and we were never able to figure out how a company called FTI was created 1 week before receiving a contract by somebody from Ontario, linked to Baylis later. We would have needed multiple meetings for that. So, Mr. Chair, I believe that with 6 meetings, when we look at how things are organized in l'École and the matters that are relevant, and I visited this site multiple times. In 2018, for example, there were tents that were built to welcome 3,000 people and never did. It takes more than 1 or 2 meetings to shed a light on what's happening there. And we're talking about $500,000, $500,000. And we're renewing contracts and asking 6 meetings is reasonable given the complexity of the matter. And if after 3 meetings we've received all the answers, we can end it there. But we should plan to have 6 meetings, and if we finish sooner, then great. But to have an amendment and say 2 meetings is enough, after that we toss it under the rug, well, that would be the same issue that we had with Baylis and Tango Marketing. A contract of $100 million for having masks from China, and they were terrible. And yes, that was solved, but there was a contract that went up in flames like that. So this is not the first example of such a case since 2015 of shady activities. And I don't think that with 2 meetings we'll have enough time, especially with only 5 minutes to ask our questions.
Go ahead.
Mon collègue, monsieur.
In English, we say you're jumping the shark. There's a scandal with Mr. Baylis and his partner. And what we did, we invited him to this committee. We didn't even fill out all our time asking questions because people realized right away that there was nothing there. I was a member of the committee. You weren't here. You weren't there. And Mr. Baylis was there with his partner, a conservative, who had invited Mr. Baylis to be a part of that. And what are you doing now? You are dirtying what we're doing. I was expecting more from you, Mr. Paulus, with your experience in Parliament, with your excellent reputation. But we had discussions here.
Debate is not relevant to the amendment. We're only talking about 2 meetings.
Okay,
Think that we should get to the function of the meeting, to go in about individuals and all that. I think we should be just talking about.
Excusez-moi.
Okay, well, through the chair, first of all, I want to say thank you, Mr. Bazan, for raising the issue of debate on the amendment itself, or the sub-amendment, to which I did give you had quite a bit in that intervention without yet getting to the sub-amendment. So I would ask that you do so. Go ahead.
Je soulève.
I raise this because when Mr. Paulus spoke, 6 7 times he mentioned the MP for Pierrefonds Dollard. And no one batted an eye because he was saying that we only had one meeting. Mr. Chair, we spent a lot of time on that file. We'd spent so much time. We had spent many meetings talking about that, and we decided that there was nothing there. It was a witch hunt. It was a smear campaign led by a former MP. Let's come back to what Mr. Green said. When we have these types of campaign that are unwarranted, that we're spending 6 or 7 meetings on a topic that has no content.
Of order,
Oui,
and
je
thank you.
parle de-
Yes,
je parle de ce point.
I tried to keep Mr. Bazan's intervention pretty quick on that, and I had awarded, I think, a fair bit of latitude in your intervention. I merely point out that your remarks should address the sub-amendment, and so just be careful to do that as you continue, and go ahead. You
Je
have the
vais
floor.
continuer à parler de sous-amendement. Et
I will continue to talk about the sub-amendment. We want to limit it to 2 meetings, because when we do more than that, when there's no proof beyond saying, oh, we found out this person's name, we found it on a public and transparent list from StatsCan for people who give more than $100 to a political party, up to $1,600 a year, that's all that people are interested in. And that's what I find unfortunate in this case. Because if not, what Mr. Paulus suggested is going to be the result. We're making allegations that are not founded. That's why, Mr. Chair, I believe that 6 meetings are too many. And I say that with a lot of respect for Mr. Paulus, because he has a great reputation. He made a mistake this time, and it's unfortunate, but overall, I think he has a good reputation. I'm using the wrong expression. But his comments this time do not do him justice. But he has such a great reputation that is well deserved. So hopefully he'll stop repeating those remarks. I'm certain that he will not continue saying these things outside of this room. So I hope that he will not continue to do that here. Now, let's come back to the matter at hand, the sub-amendment, and 2 meetings. Mr. Chair, again, this is the best way for us to ensure to have a good idea. We can see if there's something fishy, and if there is, we can examine things more in depth. Or if there's something that we find shocking, well, then we can send it to the Auditor General, for example, who could do a more in-depth investigation. Or I could imagine other groups, such as the Ethics Commissioner. But I'm confident, and I would be willing to bet on this, that we won't get very far, and we will have wasted at least 4 meetings of our committee. 4 meetings that could have been spent on access to information or other files that have been proposed by MPs around this table. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Did you have your hand up? Otherwise, I'm going to go to the vote on the sub-amendment. But, okay. Seeing no other speakers, are there any opposed to the sub-amendment? Okay, we will proceed then to a vote on the sub-amendment.
So the vote is on,
Yeah, you're still.
if everybody ready, I will proceed to the recorded vote, and it is on the sub-amendment, rule admissible by the chair, from Mr. Khalid to replace 6 meetings for 2 meetings. Mr. Baines.
I vote for.
Monsieur Fergus. Ms. Hefner. Ms. Khalid. Ms. Sachs.
In favor.
Mr. Bazan. Mr. Carrick.
I'm opposed.
Mr. Williams.
Opposed.
Monsieur Villemur. Mr. Green.
Opposed.
Mr. Chair, the result is 5-5.
Microphone, please.
Sorry, did you capture my vote? Okay, my microphone I think was not on. So the motion is the sub amendment is defeated. We are back to the amendment, and I think you were trying to get my attention. Did you want to speak on the amendment?
I do, Mr. Chair, but
Okay.
I've taken up a lot of people's time, so I'd love if anyone else would want to speak. I'll be before I go there.
This is deferring to others. Is there anybody else that wishes to speak to the amendment? Go ahead, Ms. Khalid.
Thank you, Chair. Just given the comments made by my colleagues here, perhaps I will very quickly try to compromise a little bit further on the number of meetings and propose a sub-amendment for 3 meetings, perhaps. And I will not debate this. We can go to a vote on this. I just would, again, encourage my colleagues here to perhaps contemplate and consider how much more we have on the agenda and how we can really narrow the scope, as again, as Mr. Bazan said, to keep a tight study on this issue, specifically this issue. And I think it is possible to do it in 3 meetings. I would encourage members to support, Chair.
In the interim, since the earlier sub-amendment, I've conferred with the clerk on this issue of material change, and there's a couple of ways we can handle this. If there's unanimous consent of the committee, we can withdraw the amendment and bring your amendment and make your suggestion into an amendment to the main motion, debate it and vote on it, and I think that would be the better way to do it. I perhaps might have handled the other one differently around the material change to the intent of the amendment. So if I see nodding, is there anyone opposed to withdrawing Ms. Hefner's amendment and allowing Ms. Khalid to then make
Point
the
of order?
amendment? Yep. Go ahead, Mr. Green.
In my opinion, Ms. Hefner's motion was more materially different from the main motion than Ms. Khaled's motion. Like, if the intent is that we're just going to move sub-amendments and change the days and continue to eat up the meeting, I'm not on for any of that. So I'm opposed to that. I'd like to get back to Ms. Hefner's motion and then get to the main motion, and then get on to the study if possible.
I'll take it from that I do not have unanimous consent to proceed in the way I had suggested, and then I'm going to rule the sub-amendment out of order. We will go to the amendment. If there's no discussion, we'll vote on the amendment, and then if there are other amendments, we will deal with them. Any discussion on Mr. Fergus? Go ahead.
Just because I imagine that there is a unified view as to what is going to happen here. I'm just going to take people at their word when they say that if they feel that there is nothing there after a couple of meetings, that they will then won't entertain to waste the time of the committee nor ruin the reputation of Parliament in general and shut it down. So I look forward to that, Mr. Chair.
I don't see any other anyone else seeking the floor on the amendment. So are there any members opposed to the amendment? Yes. Okay. We'll go, Madam Clerk, to a vote on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The vote is on the amendment from Ms. Hefner that the phrase where it says 6 meetings be deleted. Mr. Baines.
I vote for.
Monsieur Fergus.
Je vote en faveur.
Ms. Hefner.
Moi aussi en faveur.
Ms. Khalid.
I vote in favor.
Ms. Sachs.
In favor.
Mr. Bazan. Mr. Kirk.
I am opposed.
Mr. Williams.
Je suis contre.
Monsieur Villemur.
Je suis contre.
Mr. Green.
I'm also opposed.
Mr. Chair, yeas 5, nays 5.
Okay, I am opposed. So, we are back on the main motion, looking for speakers on the main motion. So I have Mr. Fergus followed by Ms. Khalid. Go ahead, Mr. Fergus.
Mr. Chair, rather, we have this motion by my colleague from Monsieur Villemur to invite some specific people on this item, and then some people who are left nameless. I think if the chair would feel that it would be appropriate, I'm beginning to think that why would we want to name particular people who occupy certain positions within our federal public service, who are responsible for different aspects of this, for how do we know that person is not about to head off on parental leave or on sick leave or for whatever reason, and then what ends up happening is that we can end up having not 6 but now 12 meetings because we got to wait, or this is going to just drag on and on. I would say that perhaps I would hope that my colleague across the way would consider leaving speaking to the position that people hold, who can best talk to these issues, as opposed to naming particular individuals. That way, it allows the clerk to reach the appropriate person to making sure that they can come forward, and that we can discharge of our duties as quickly and efficiently as possible, even though the framework, I really do believe, is dissatisfactory to me.
Before I take the next speaker, I will just draw attention to the wording of the motion. This is a motion to invite, and we often invite witnesses, and witnesses do not always accept the invitation. And when a witness doesn't accept an invitation, we will often examine reasons for that a witness might have declined an invitation, such as straightforward availability, as you point out, Mr. Fergus, and if and then it's up to the committee what steps they may want to take further, or in stronger terms than invitation. But the motion only does move to invite, not to compel at this stage. So I will go to Ms. Khalid next.
Sorry, Chair. I think Ms. Yara's hand was up before mine was.
Okay, I had her after you. I had her after you, but you're welcome to switch your order if you wish.
I'm happy to take this slot.
Okay, go ahead. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So now that we're back to the main amendment, I feel really important that it's really important that we clarify here the importance of Roxham Road in keeping asylum seekers safe and healthy and protected, so they don't freeze when they arrive to our borders, that they're not sick, that they are coming for safety, and that's what Roxham Road is. It's a port of entry for those who are desperate to find safety, and I think we need to keep that in mind as we go through the machinations of this, of bringing witnesses forward and understanding what we're trying to get to in the heart of this. You know, Mr. Chair, prior to the pandemic, it fluctuates year by year, but based on the numbers that I've seen, Roxham Road seems anywhere between 18 to 20,000 a year pre-pandemic, and now already here we are we're at the beginning of October, and this year already 20,000 have crossed the border, have crossed at Roxham Road seeking safety here. So there has been a heightened need to provide service to those who are seeking asylum here. And we as Canadians, we have never turned our blind eye to that, and nor should we at this moment. And I understand the concerns of my colleague, Monsieur Villemur, in bringing this forward, and what Monsieur Huss has also put forward in what's been in the media. But I think we also have to differentiate between the noise and the facts of why Roxham Road operates, and the principles and the values behind it that we have committed to, not just as a government, but as Canadians, to those who seek shelter and safety. And, you know, when this is a concerted effort of IRCC, CBSA, and procurement to provide that safety, that asylum to those who are coming, crossing at this border crossing at Saint-Bernard-de-la-Colle. And we have to understand that since, you know, we're looking at the amounts of money that are in question, but we also have to recognize that the road that they're entering on, Roxham Road, is Rue Gay. There is one landlord at Roxham Road, and it's Monsieur Pierre Gay. And whether he's donated to Conservatives in the past, which he has, or whether he's donated to Liberals in the past, which he also has, to their parties, respective parties, at the end of the day, Monsieur Gay is the landlord there. And my colleague, Mr. Green, having sat in OGO and other committees, would know perfectly well that when there are sole proprietors, procurement has procedures in place to negotiate agreements at market value and to ensure that all the steps in that process are taken appropriately. There is no other competitor there, from what I understand, from what I've seen of the mappings and understanding. And what are we talking about? We're talking about winterized safety shelters where they can provide nurses and point of entry immigration people to help with processing and filing. So let's just be clear of what is happening in this space of Roxham Road, and who is being served, and the purpose, and also who owns the space that we as Canadians are trying to provide a service in that space for the folks who are coming through. And I am all for transparency, and I am all for accountability, and I'm all for the clarity of understanding what happens in this space. But, you know, if we're looking for a gotcha moment of a smoking gun, I certainly hope that it is not at the expense of the 20,000 vulnerable men, women, and children who cross this border year after year seeking safety here in Canada, for the sake of time in this committee. So I appreciate Mr. Green's comments that, you know, if he feels that he is satisfied that no untoward contracts were issued, but as he mentioned, he sat on other committees, so he knows perfectly well how sole proprietor commercial contracts are awarded when in a case like this where there is another owner of this space that IRCC and CBSAS had to set up services for safety. That we're really, really, really clear on why we're going to take up to 6 meetings on this, on what is an essential part of what we hold dear as Canadians of providing safe harbor for those who are seeking safety. And I really feel it's important to keep that lens in play as we move through Mr. Villemeure's, because we can get caught up in the noise on this and all of that. But at the end of the day, where do our priorities lie in ensuring that those who are fleeing from human rights violations and other atrocities around the world who seek safety here are best protected when they come through our ports of entry? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Sachs, and I have Ms. Khalid next.
Thanks, Chair. I won't echo a lot of what Ms. Sachs has said other than to really agree with her. I think we have established a work plan, and I did say this, and I'll just refresh members opposite's memory who are all looking down on their phones, that it would be nice for us to add this study to our docket of studies that we have proposed. Like I've indicated before, we have the ATIP study, the access to information, that is up next. I myself have proposed 2 studies which deal with the use of microphones and security within and cybersecurity for vehicles as they're more and more digitalized. The second is the issue of privacy as it comes to children's use of devices more and more. I think those are 2 very important and very pertinent issues. So I would propose an amendment, and I, again, don't want to debate this, but I would hope that members opposite would take it into consideration to, again, put this study on the docket of all of the other studies that we have and create a work plan in a more collaborative way. So I would propose, Chair, that we strike the words as soon as possible. I'll wait.
Sorry, I was for a quick moment there. Did
Yes, I was going to move an amendment, Chair.
Yeah, please go ahead.
To strike the words as soon as possible from this motion in the first line, the effect of which would ultimately place this motion within the longer list of work plans and studies that we have proposed in this committee, to make sure that we're prioritizing all of the issues that we have, each and every one of us, presented before this committee, and ensure that we're keeping triaging and keeping order of the work that needs to get done here. Thanks, Chair.
So we have another amendment. The amendment is in order. Before I open it up for further debate on the amendment, I will share with the committee that it had been my intent, had this motion passed unamended, to continue on with the Wednesday meeting as scheduled. My ruling of as soon as possible would have granted that it will take more than a couple of days to arrange the first meeting, and it had been my intention to continue and at least go ahead with the Wednesday meeting as is on notice. So I put that out there to all members so you understand how I would have interpreted the as soon as possible, but which is just that, as soon as you can realistically put further meetings together. So with that, I will open up for debate on the amendment, and I just put that out there in case that colors anyone's thoughts on this amendment. Go ahead, Ms. Khalid.
Thanks, Chair. And while I understand, your interpretation and respect your interpretation as chair of this committee, I've been in committees where we've tried to eat multiple sandwiches at the same time or take on lots of studies at the same time. It just doesn't work. In that, sorry, Mr. Bazan, I couldn't hear you while I was talking. I'm not able to listen and talk at the same time, unfortunately. So what I am, kind of concerned about is that when we do try to do two studies at the same time, I just don't want us to basically take, don't do justice to both of the studies that we're trying to get done at the same time. I just think it'd be more efficient for us to get through the ATIP study and then move on to other studies that we have on the docket, including this one, Chair, would be my take. So when it says as soon as possible in this motion, to me, and my interpretation is that, basically put aside everything else and get to this first and foremost, which I don't think is a proper triage of the work that is before this committee.
Thank you. I have Monsieur Villemure and then Mr. Fergus.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've heard many arguments today. We took 2 hours to not get to the first point, and I think that's unfortunate. I would like to reassure my colleague, Mr. Fergus, that witnesses that were identified have been advised, and everyone knows that the subject is important. We talked about the length of the study, but to start examining an important topic, we need to simply start. What are people going to think if we don't get anything done today? I would like to see a bit of goodwill from my colleagues across the room so that we can start. Thank you.
Mr. Fergus.
J'ai deux questions, Monsieur.
I have 2 questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that clarification, and thank you, Mr. Villemure, for his clarification as well. 2 questions for Mr. Villemure. Witnesses have already been advised that they would be invited. Who sent out that message? Because as committee, we did not have the chance to talk about it, so I would like to know who spoke on my behalf. Secondly, Mr. Chair, thank you for your clarification that you say as soon as possible doesn't mean that we'll start hearing witnesses in 48 hours, but that you'll take the time to do things properly. But that raises another question. When, according to you, if this amendment does not pass, when will the deadline be for submitting potential witnesses to you or to the clerk so that these people may be invited? I imagine we'll do this as a committee and not as individuals. But yeah, those are my questions.
Just weigh in again, since you're putting some of these points straight to me before I carry on with the speaking list. I had it had been my contention that yes, as soon as possible meant that Wednesday would not have been possible. So that was my thought on that, on seeing the motion. It's why the notice went up today for Wednesday. I always, or I have in the past, when a motion like this is adopted, to ask parties immediately to supply witnesses, and I always encourage them. I always encourage parties or members to supply their witnesses to the analysts as soon as they can, and that the submission of witnesses never need be final. So it's better to inform the analysts immediately if you know certain witnesses you wish to invite, and if you find another witness or discover a witness that's available to you, you can always follow up with the analyst. But that would be, as has always been my practice, to encourage the supplying of witness names as soon as possible, like within a few days of adoption of this motion, should it be adopted. I think I covered your questions. I know that you had, in part of your intervention, had put questions to Mr. Villemure, but I'm going to take my speakers in the order that they are on the list, and I'm only going to take interventions from those that wish to get on the list. So I have Ms. Sachs next, if you're finished. Okay, then we will go to Ms. Sachs, and we'll see after that if we have anybody else that wishes to speak. Go ahead, Ms. Sachs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Fergus actually jumped ahead and clarified the question that I had, that under the chair's interpretation, when witnesses would be due, and I appreciate the clarification that, if there is an openness for ongoing submission of witnesses. And I just want to defer to Mr. Villemure just for a moment to say, respectfully, we sat here last week in camera on a motion as well, and there's been certainly ceding of time. I've always been happy to work across the floor with colleagues to make sure that we get important issues tabled, and colleagues know that perfectly well. And respect works both ways, and the way this was presented and the opportunity to work respectfully on this, sadly did not feel, certainly I did not feel that was put forward in my own collaborative efforts across the way, and it's unfortunate that we've had to go through so many machinations of clarification today to ensure that the heart of the matter as we proceed with this study are clear, and the timeline, frankly, because there is other work on the docket which I would like to see accomplished. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Are there any others that wish to speak on the amendment? Okay, that. Go ahead. Okay.
J'apprécierais juste une petite précision.
I would just appreciate if Mr. Villemure can clarify something. It's not going to take long.
As all members, but are you?
J'aimerais répondre à mon.
I would like to respond to my colleague. It's up to the clerk to invite people. It's not René Villemure who invites witnesses. But before putting a name on the list, I communicate with people and ask them if they would want to participate. But the invitation will be done once the list is sent to the clerk.
Okay. With that, we're on the amendment. Are there any opposed to the amendment? Go ahead.
I can read the amendment. The amendment is to delete the words "as soon as possible."
Okay, I hear I hear a member opposed. We'll go to the vote on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The vote on the amendment, as I was saying, to delete the words "as soon as possible." Mr. Baines.
I vote for.
Monsieur Fergus. Ms. Hefner.
En faveur.
Ms. Khalid.
In favor.
Ms. Sachs.
Je vote pour.
Mr. Bazan.
Je vote contre.
Mr. Kirk.
I'm opposed.
Mr. Williams.
Je suis contre.
Monsieur Villemure. Mr. Green.
I'm opposed.
Mr. Chair, yeas 5, nays 5.
Okay, and then I vote, to oppose the amendment. So we are back to the main motion. Are there any speakers on the main motion? Go ahead, Ms. Khalid.
Thanks, Chair. I will say this really quickly. I understand that we're running out of time, but all of the points that I raised today, all of my little amendments, were conversations that we could have had you guys felt that you could have just talked to me, picked up the phone. You always have my numbers. We sit here together for hours and hours. We could have had a discussion about the substance of this. I am not opposed to us studying this. I raised my issues with you. We could have done it together. We could have surpassed all of this if we had just been a little bit more collaborative. So again, I encourage members, let's work together, folks, and in good faith, because I have that good faith, and I hope that you would too. Thank you.
Are there any others that wish to speak to the main motion? Okay, go ahead.
Just support what Ms. Khalid had said, and I hope I'm not revealing anything in camera, but I'm pretty certain these were all in public. I think this is the third time she's raised this issue. Folks, let's work together. On peut travailler ensemble.
We can work together. We've proved this more than once. We have good friendships between us. Please take the time to communicate with us. Communicate with Ms. Khalid and I before tabling such a bill.
Is there anyone on the is there anyone here opposed to the main motion? Okay, Madam Clerk, I'll ask for a vote on the main motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Le vote est sur la motion proposée par Monsieur.
The vote is on Mr. Villemur's motion.
I'm voting against, please.
Thank you, Monsieur Fergus.
Qu'elle est écrite, je suis contre.
As written, I am against.
Ms. Hefner.
Contre.
Ms. Khalid.
I'm against.
Ms. Sachs.
Je vote contre.
Mr. Bazan.
I am in favor. It's a good motion.
Mr. Kurek.
I am in favor.
Mr. Williams.
I vote for.
Monsieur Villemur.
Je suis pour.
Mr. Green.
I'm for.
Mr. Chair, yeas 5, nays 5.
Okay, I vote in favor. So the motion is carried, and with that, meeting adjourned.